So I want to focus a bit on challenges and some solutions around data security and privacy. And Fasoo is a company that focuses on unstructured data, so documents and files that everybody uses every day. We don't do things with databases, but all the stuff that everybody works with that's growing exponentially, that nobody has any idea where it is, what it is, and we all have to deal with it and manage it. So I'm going to focus on how do organizations try to cope with all of this? And I think with Gen AI and people trying to create private LLMs and using public APIs, it's just becoming more and more complicated. Okay. So rapidly changing IT environment is something that you could have in every single presentation for the last 20 years because that's pretty normal. But this is what most organizations are dealing with. So the biggest issues that I think tend to come up are, in the last few years, the hybrid workforce has become the norm. Global companies have people everywhere. You know, we always had mobile people, but now it's everybody everywhere, anytime, needs access to sensitive data, and we have to be able to enable that. There are a lot of threats that people are still dealing with, both inside and outside. So insider threats I put into two categories. You have malicious people, and you have what I call oops. So oops is I accidentally sent an email to the wrong person, and I sent it to my competitor accidentally, or to the wrong client or customer. That's an oops. Everybody does it, everybody fat fingers. Malicious attacks can be for both insiders, you have a disgruntled employee, or nation states, hackers, script kiddies. It depends who you want to talk about. There's only a couple reasons why somebody wants your stuff. They either want to steal your data for financial gain, they want to ruin you, or they want to sort of disrupt your operation. And most data falls into two categories, really three categories. One category is it's sensitive and it's regulated, which big deal in the financial industry. It's IP, or it's I don't care. It's not anything that's really particularly sensitive. So this is kind of the world we're all dealing with. So there's two approaches that organizations take to protecting data. One is a perimeter-based approach, and one is what we refer to as a data-centric approach. So a perimeter approach is essentially trying to put a moat around the data. So the problem with that is there's no moat anymore. There's no logical boundary that anybody has anymore. You've got data on phones, in the cloud, laptops, Salesforce, you name it, documents are everywhere. And so trying to put a series of technologies into place that are going to protect all of those locations becomes very, very complicated. I refer to it as whack-a-mole. As soon as you plug one hole, somebody's going to find another one. People don't allow you to put something on a USB drive, or they're somehow going to find a way to store something in OneDrive. Or they are going to somehow get it onto a Google Drive. They're going to stick it in the cloud. You put in a CASB, but there are ways to get around that. So the problems that you have is, in the financial industry, very heavily regulated. So a couple years ago, when the New York Division of Financial Services came out with their NYDFS laws, that was one of the first things, I think, to hit specifically around here, where they were talking about all these controls you need to get into place. And eventually they started talking about encryption as sort of an ultimate technology. And to address all these things, we got compliance issues. So I want to make sure that I'm compliant with my customer data as well as my own internal data. And the regulators do what the regulators do. We also have financial losses that come about. Sometimes it's a matter of, if you're not protecting your customers' data, then your customers are going to choose to go elsewhere. That's one issue. If you get a breach in in the New York Times, then you have additional financial losses. And then AI complicates this in many, many ways, whether it's a public or a private LLM that you're dealing with. One of the problems you've got is hallucinations. So there was a great, I remember it was a year or two ago, there were these attorneys that got disbarred because they had asked ChatGPT to basically create briefs for them when it was all based on nonsense. So AI is just making things more complicated. I look at AI as it's not some newfangled thing. It's just another thing we have to deal with. It's another technology. It's another set of ingress and egress points that just make things, a little bit more complicated to manage. So the era of what I call advanced data security, the cloud and remote hybrid work has really exacerbated the problem. Like I said, it used to be a little bit easier to be able to control where data is going, and the problem is it's almost impossible today. We have customers that are trying to lock things down. They try to lock it down to certain storage locations. They have a lot of controls around the data. They have a lot of technologies where they are trying to determine what is sensitive. But again, if you're trying to do things at a perimeter level, then it's going to be very, very difficult. So what we do is, again, we try to say, think about the data. The data is what's important. The data is inside of a document. That should really be where your controls are, not a location, because that changes all the time and gets very, very complicated. Compliance, of course, is always an issue. It doesn't matter where you are. If you're a global company, you're having to deal with GDPR in the EU. In the United States, there's a variety of regulations that are continuously changing. If you're dealing with any healthcare-related information, of course, you have your HIPAA. If you're a public company, you got SOX related. So there's all kinds of compliance issues. The complexity gets into the fact of no matter what you do to put controls into place, there are always exceptions that need to be made. We had a customer a couple of years ago from one of the big banks in New York who said that there were so many exceptions in their DLP system that they essentially did not have a DLP system, because they're just business challenges are constantly, necessitating different moves. And then, the volume of cyber threats, every day there's something going on. So this just becomes more and more complicated. I think what a lot of customers are looking at is they're looking at detection and response type of tools to try to address that. And in some cases, it does a good job. In some cases, it tends to miss things, because sometimes you're seeing things after the fact. After somebody has exfiltrated data because of ransomware isn't really helpful. I need to make sure that there's a way to either prevent that, or if somebody exfiltrates, there's no value to what they've in fact taken. Okay. So what's very important in the environment is to understand what you have. Like I said, most organizations don't really understand what data they have because it's all over the place. There's shadow IT stuff going on. People, they do things in the cloud, and they might go into AWS and create an S3 bucket for testing purposes, and then they forget about it, and all of a sudden that becomes something that you have to wind up managing. So the approach that I think is the best around this is to find the data that's of importance to you, whatever that means. There's some level of sensitivity that you are defining. It could be PII data. It could be data related to a project. It could be HR. It could be customer data. Whatever that is, you have to find it. And then anything that is sensitive, again, whatever that means to you, or it's regulated data, you need to somehow label that or tag that. And then once you've done that, now you could say, what controls beyond that do I want to put into place? So what I'm going to define in a few minutes is what we call advanced data security. There's a number of levels to that. Okay. So when people are working with documents, there are really three phases of data. So there's data at rest, and there's lots of technology. So it's sitting on my phone, it's sitting on a hard drive, it's sitting in the cloud on somebody's hard drive in a system. That's data at rest. There's a lot of technologies, both endpoint as well as other systems that can protect that. I've got endpoint encryption. And so what I recommend is the first things to understand at that point is what is the data you have. So what do you have? How do you tag it? Levels of classification. Different customers have different schemas. Some of the things we've recommended to people is to say there's really two types of data. There's data that's important to your organization, and then there's public data. So non-public data is probably what most people care about, and then there's granularity in there. There might be things that are restricted that maybe only C-level should access or the board, and then there's other information that is sensitive to the company, and it's okay if people inside, but I want to make sure that that stuff doesn't get exfiltrated. And then you need to start thinking about data access governance, and again, what does that mean? So it means that I want to control access or at least have an understanding of who has access to that data. So that's kind of the basics of data security. Once we start getting above that, one term that's become very popular in the last few years is DSPM, Data Security Posture Management. It started out as a set of technologies to really help govern data that's in the cloud. And I think it has expanded quite a bit. There's a lot of on-prem that is being used with DSPM. And what a lot of DSPM is to do with a term called data lineage. And this became, again, very popular with a lot of regulations. It's a matter of, do I know who has accessed this document throughout its life cycle? And understanding that has a lot of importance in the organization because you want to make sure that only the right people have access to that data. As you start moving up the stack, eventually you get to an area that we tend to focus on, which is really data encryption and digital rights management. So this is really now looking at the data itself. A lot of the other tools, again, they're very valuable and they do a good job at what they do. But if ultimately you're trying to protect that spreadsheet that has very sensitive information or a Word document or PowerPoint or a CAD file or whatever it is, a lot of these other things are really just putting perimeters around the data. So I'm looking at locations. I'm looking at movement of data. If I encrypt the document and I assign access controls to that, and the access controls are dynamic in that every time a user goes to access a file, they have to be validated, authenticated, and based on a policy are allowed or not allowed to do certain things, I then don't really care where the data goes. So if it's on my phone or it's in a cloud or it's on my laptop, I always have protection. So it tends to reduce some of the challenges that people have with SOC alerts going off all day long because they're watching the movement of data. So this is kind of where you get to the top, where you're really looking at the data itself. Okay. So if you start at the top and from a business point of view, what you want to look at is really risk tolerance when it comes to sensitive data. So I have business strategies that are intended to grow the business. And then once you start thinking about that, you think about, okay, what are the governance strategies that I need to start putting into place to meet a lot of these requirements? So in the financial industry, there's a lot of compliance we need to think about. So I need to understand what is it that I need to do from the point of view of a regulator to satisfy that regulator. So that's basic compliance. And then beyond that, I want to make sure that my customer and internal data is safe because I don't want to have a breach with all that entails. I don't want to prove to my customer that I'm not a trustworthy organization. And again, a lot of this is balanced risk. Everything in IT and everything in security is balancing risk. So I want to make sure I can minimize my risk, but I don't not want to impact productivity to the point where my customers or my user base can't work. So those are big. So once you start looking at that, then you want to start looking at your data, and you want to prioritize it. So, in certain financial companies we've been dealing with over the years, they have customer data. They might have a wealth management practice. That's very high value data to them. They might have audit type of information inside the organization. Again, that's very high value data. So you want to start thinking about prioritizing this information. The one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to spend 2 years going through a data classification project to get so granular in your thinking that it precludes you from moving to the next step. And I think we've dealt with a lot of customers who spend so much time worrying about every little point that they're trying to analyze that they don't get to the end state. If the end state is I'm trying to protect things, one approach that we've suggested, I think I said earlier, is you've got NPI and you got public. If you could start there and then say, let's start putting controls around that, that at least gets you closer to what you're trying to do. So once you've identified what it is you want to protect, now you got to start thinking about how you're going to do that. What are the security levers? What are the policies and controls that you're going to put into place? So we also talk about, and a lot of organizations talk about, zero trust approaches to data protection. And so in the world of data, zero trust is really meaning that anytime a user goes to access a document, they need to be validated and authorized to do that. And just because you were 5 minutes ago doesn't mean you're going to be again. So you need policies in place to be able to address that, because things change. Business changes, conditions changes, people move departments, levels of sensitivity change. Let's say the finance group and the CFO are putting together a set of documents that are going to be made public for your quarterly earnings. Well, while you're in process of doing that, that set of information is extremely important. As soon as you announce earnings, that's now public, so that has now changed. I need to be able to accommodate that with some kind of a policy change. And in the security side, like I said, I kind of break it into a couple of different buckets. The discovery is the how do I find the information that's of importance to me. The second one is I want to put some kind of a label or a tag on that to identify that as being something sensitive to me. And it could be something as simple as it's confidential or it's public. And it's just a simple way to start going down that process. Encryption is important, and there's different levels of encryption. I have endpoint encryption, where I'm just going to do some basic encryption on my laptop or on my endpoint device. But I really don't have any other controls once I remove the data from it. So that helps to protect against somebody stealing my laptop, let's say. The next level encryption is to encrypt the documents in a way where I'm going to assign access controls to that. And an access control is now I want to validate, like I said earlier, when a user opens up a document, I need a policy in place to say, do they have rights to this document? If they do, what am I going to allow them to do? And I could even say, I only want to allow them to do it for a period of time. So these are more controls that people tend to put in place, which simplifies the process of managing this data. And then nothing works unless you actually have an audit trail. So some organizations like to audit everything. Sometimes you have to prove to regulators that I can show you that all of our data was in fact protected. These are the people who had access to that data over the last 6 months. And so I at least have provability to a regulator. In certain circumstances, it's a level of understanding of, are the right people having access to documents, and do I need to change that? So that's another thing where you got to start thinking about these policies. There's no such thing as a set it and forget it policy. I need to start monitoring, do the right people have access to data, and can I in fact prove that that's important? The last thing at the very bottom is you got to look at where is the data. So at the top I was talking about finding it, but now I got to start looking at, do I have data in the cloud? Do I have on-prem repositories? Do I have endpoints that I'm concerned about? One thing we found is no matter how much an organization is trying to get everybody to save their documents into SharePoint or to a file share somewhere, stuff just still winds up everywhere. So you're going to have to really be able to address the documents no matter where they are. So this is kind of a high-level look at a platform approach that looks at all of the different phases that I was talking about. So at rest means when a document is encrypted and it's sitting on some hard drive somewhere, it's protected. When it's in transit, there's a lot of, our TLS technologies worry about the transit, But here I don't have to worry about transit. Could also mean I'm copying a document to a thumb drive. Access, as I mentioned, is I want to control access to a document at all times, regardless of where it is, inside the company, outside the company, shared with a third party, shared with a regulator. The in-use protections, we have the ability to say, not only am I controlling access to the document, but what am I allowing a user to do with the document? Maybe I only want them to view this document. Maybe I want them to edit it. Maybe I don't want them to print it, or maybe I don't want them to take a screen capture, or maybe I want to only allow them access for 30 days. So these are granular controls, again, which are different controls that are dynamic, that can change depending on the user, depending on the sensitivity of the data. And then monitoring and auditing all that, again, is important, especially for regulatory compliance, because a lot of people need to prove out things. And then below that, so these capabilities are the things I've been talking about. The ability to find, identify, protect, and manage documents securely in an easy-to-use way. So I don't want to have specialized tools. I want to allow people to do what they normally do. People are opening documents in Word and Excel and PowerPoint and Adobe Acrobat, and they should still be allowed to do that while still maintaining all of the security that's involved. There are other interesting exfiltration areas that people don't tend to think about. One is a screen, and one is a print. So even if I'm printing to a PDF, that's a print function. If I'm printing to a piece of paper, it's something people don't think about as additional exfiltration vectors. But there have been a lot of news stories. I remember a few years ago, I think it was at one of the pharmaceutical companies, there were a bunch of scientists who were printing out very sensitive data, and that's how they were stealing it, because that was really not something that IT or security was focused on. They're focused on digital data. Another one is a screen. So if you're in a CRM system or you have a call center or something like that, there's a lot of sensitive data that's up on a screen, and people could take out a phone and take a picture of it, and now you have a data breach and compromise. So those are additional controls that could be layered into the idea of data protection. And then I had started out by talking about this idea of data lineage. And so in our technology, we have what we call a content ID, and our CRO likes to talk about it like almost like a GPS tag. And so anytime a document gets encrypted, there's a unique identifier that gets associated with that document. If you make a derivative or a copy of that document, save as a PDF or just make a copy, that tag follows it, and that's how to track data lineage. So the next time a user opens a document somewhere, I can see that and track that particular tag. So I don't have to worry about where the documents are. It's kind of almost like a self-reporting thing. The other thing that I think is critical in any type of a data security strategy or approach is to have centralized policies that do not rely on end users to become security experts. So if people are old enough to remember the original PGP, where there was a way for an individual to kind of encrypt a file and they had to manage some kind of a key, that's relying on an end user to become an expert. That's the last thing anybody wants to do. People have jobs to do. And so having centralized policies that are dynamic enough that allow the organization to control without having to bother the user is also something that's very important. I think another thing that's important, which is really kind of in the change management and the exception management arena, is I need to be able to flexibly allow lower levels in the organization to be able to control things. So I need to be able to delegate down maybe to a department manager the ability to set a policy for that particular department. I don't always want to go back to IT or the security organization to be able to change policies that are going to affect kind of people on a day-to-day basis. So having flexible policies that are central but do have a decentralization component, I think is very important. And the other thing that I think is a challenge for most organizations is every tool has a log. And even if you consolidate everything into your SIM, you still have a million pieces of data that you have to sort through. So at least in the case here, if I can say that I've got one set of logs for all of my sensitive data, I have one source of truth, which I think just makes kind of everything a lot simpler. So if you need to prove something to a regulator, or you're just trying to understand, how people are using sensitive documents, you have everything in one location. All right. So as I mentioned, Fasoo is an organization that focuses on data security at the file level. So we really don't do anything with databases. We're focused on the documents and the files that everybody uses every day. We have a suite of tools. I know it looks like alphabet soup up there, but they're really in a couple of categories, and they focus on the entire life cycle of a document, from finding it to tagging it to managing it, and from the creation to sort of destruction of a document. You can see sort of a lineage that goes through that entire responsibility. The Smart Print and the Smart Screen are two tools that I was talking about that have to do with helping to manage both print and screen, because again, those are potential exfiltration vectors that somebody could easily take advantage of. And so we do have ways to address that. And then of course, everybody always has collaboration needs outside of the organization. And so we have a suite of tools that will allow kind of soup to nuts for all of that. So thank you very much for listening. Okay, thank you very much.